Chapter 9. During the 5 or so days preceding the full moon, one sign of the coming lycanthropic transformation stands above all others. The signs are numerous in total: dramatic increase in hair growth, lengthening and thickening of the teeth and fingernails, hunger of an inhumanly bottomless nature, specifically for meat, cooked or raw. Other food groups start to become less appealing and maybe even somewhat repulsive, and sharpening of the wolfman's already very sharp senses. For the most part, the signs can generally be observed and recognized by outsiders. The one sign that cannot be observed by outsiders, he says, which also happens to be the most difficult to endure, are the moon dreams. When a full month had nearly passed since Charles had linked up with Grandfather Red Eagle, both of whom were looking rather wolfish at this time, and made a home out of the living room sofa, he was asked if he'd been having any weird dreams. "Not that I remember," said Charles. "I don't usually dream." "Oh, you will, bro," said Grandfather Red Eagle, loading his peace pipe, a massive thing covered in totem-style images with feathers hanging from it. "That full moon's coming up, so it's gonna be any day now you start having the moon dreams. Boy, oh boy." He shook his head and lit the bowl with a propane blowtorch, taking little puffs in quick succession. "And may I ask what the hell a moon dream is?" Charles sat next to the Indian on the couch, waiting for the pipe to be passed over. Grandfather Red Eagle filled the room with his tobacco aroma, which smelled like southern hickory smoked beef at a barbecue. He owned several large fancy pipes and a stash of high-end tobacco, which they smoked together as a ritual after dinner and booze. Dinner tonight was venison from a deer they'd caught together and killed with their bare hands. Charles had been learning to hunt like a demon wolf. The booze tonight was rum and coke, the jug and the 2-liter bottle sitting with the leftover food on the table, being picked up to fill their glasses every now and then. Grandfather Red Eagle passed the pipe over to Charles, who smoked gluttonously as he listened. "I'ma tell you something right now, bro, and I've been saving it for about this time, so you wouldn't have to spend the whole month stressing over it. But the time's come." He picked up his rum and coke glass and held it in front of him, jingling the ice around. "I know you are a pretty heavy drinker already, Charles, but your intake, let me tell you, it's about to start getting a lot heavier. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm a lot older than you, and I've had a lot more time to build up my tolerance. I get it, but you gotta understand, I never used to drink before I had the spirit of the demon wolf in me. And now, I'm a straight-up alcoholic. Straight up, from top to bottom." Charles nodded and passed the pipe back. "So, moon dreams?" "I'm getting to it, bro, I'm getting to it." He held up his uno momento finger and took another hit before he continued. "The moon dreams, man, it's something you gotta go through when the demon wolf is in you. Something you gotta just live with. It's like these dreams, man. Nightmares. I mean horrible fucking nightmares. They come to haunt you for a few nights before you transform, like 3, 4, maybe 5 days before is when they start, normally anyways, and it's like, oh man, how do I put it?" He thought for a moment, smoking more of the pipe. The cloud he blew, combined with the already existing smoke, made the room all hazy. It was a little harder for Charles to see him clearly now, and it created a sort of stage fog, making the subject at hand that much more ominous. "You ever see Hellraiser?" the Indian asked. His sudden movement that he made as he had his light bulb moment threw the smoke into a dancing swirl. "Yeah," said Charles, taking the pipe back. "A couple times, I think." "Well," said the Indian, getting up to open a window, "imagine the shit you see in that movie, or shit that's more or less in that vein." He sat back down and waved off some of the smoke. "And fucking multiply that shit by about a dozen, bro." Grandfather Red Eagle was most likely expecting a frightened reaction, but Charles only grinned and said, "Well, alrighty then." His grin, of course, was made up of enlarged pre-transformation wolf teeth. He didn't remember much of Hellraiser, but he did remember enjoying it. Though dreaming isn't his forte under normal circumstances, Charles had his first moon dream that very same night. "You'll know when it happens," Grandfather Red Eagle had told him, "and you ain't gonna forget it. You ain't gonna forget a single one of your moon dreams. They're gonna stick with you as long as you live, and the longer you live, the more they pile up, and the more they pile up, the more you gotta booze." "Bring it on," Charles had replied, pouring more drink for himself and toasting to the idea. Sure enough, Charles was able to recount the dream for me in exquisite detail. There was a hallway, a long, extravagant one, with golden candlelit chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, huge paintings all across the walls with golden frames, intricately crafted with fancy designs. They were famous paintings, too. The Blue Boy, the Night Watch, the Scream, Mona Lisa, Socrates with his poison goblet, distorted figures probably painted by Picasso, portraits of recognizable figures like Queen Elizabeth II, Mary I, Henry VIII, Martin Luther, George Washington, Hitler, an image of Eve taking the fruit of knowledge with the serpent gleefully watching, Lucifer beating his wings in the ninth circle of hell with a guy in each hand and one in his mouth, and many more, all dancing around and changing colors, including Charles's favorite, some kind of Greek or Roman goddess, possibly Athena. This one was his favorite, he says, because she was hot. Between the paintings were many doors, large and heavy, probably handcrafted, trimmed with gold. The wallpapers were similarly trimmed, painted with symmetrical designs of long, curling lines that never quite intersected. To a stranger of this palace, all the doors might have been confusing, perhaps even intimidating, but Charles knew exactly which one he was looking for. It was the one at the end of the hallway. He was there in no time at all, reaching for the knob. He meant to just turn the knob and open the door, knowing it had been waiting unlocked for him. But the moment he made contact, the entire door immediately dissipated, the particles floating around in the air, resembling ink that was just dropped into a cup of water. Past all that, he could see the room on the other side. He stepped through the floating dust that was once a door, scattering it all into obscurity, and entered the room. It was a bedroom. The wallpaper was the same as in the hallway. A massive vanity mirror sat on one side, which he stepped in front of, only to see no reflection, just blurry, silvery nothingness that danced with little ripples like a fountain bowl. On the adjacent wall was a window, which he peered out of to look at the royal courtyard hundreds of stories down, fenced off by a gate of decidedly Gothic architecture, and nothing but hills and mountains beyond that, spanning forever and ever, all under the darkness of a night sky plagued with black clouds that covered all the stars, but lit yellow by the biggest full moon you'd ever want to see, so bright and so close that even the clouds didn't dare to stand in its way. "Charles! Oh, Charles, look this way!" The voice that called to him from behind gave him a slight jump. But when he turned around to see who was calling to him, there was no fear, but rather an eager quickening of the pulse, and the feeling of his lips involuntarily curling into that grin we've all come to know and love. Upon turning around to face the room's interior again, the moon's golden tint now reached inside, and for some reason it flickered as if lit by 1,000 crackling candles. It was a soothing effect, but at the same time it added an air of the strange, distorting everything inside. This didn't slow Charles's stride by any means, however, because the one who'd called his name was the princess of this kingdom. She leaned forward on her knees, peering through the translucent curtains that hung over her bed, hanging onto one of the posts that held them up with one hand and reaching out for him with the other. He'd noticed the bed before when he first entered the room, but he hadn't noticed anyone lying in it. Her nightgown, pink and flowing, was about as thin and delicate as the curtains. The burners flicked on in sight of Charles's heightened animal instincts, roaring steadily as his legs began their automatic stride toward the princess, ignoring her embracing hand and going straight for the tits, ripping down one of the curtains under the pressure of his knees, shoving her down on the bed so that she laid on it crossways, then pulled her up by the thighs so her head didn't hang over the edge anymore. As rough as Charles proceeded to handle her, she'd most definitely have to wear something with long sleeves the next day so her father wouldn't see the marks. She cried out in agony, and Charles could feel the warm trickle of virgin blood, but he saw no reason to slow down. Normally, he wouldn't anyways, but in this case it was totally impossible. Any trace of human sensibilities were out to lunch by now. The closer he got to his climax, the more his overall physical makeup changed. Bones fracturing and rearranging to form alien shapes, hurting a lot but not outweighing his razor-sharp focus on the task at hand. His fingernails grew out and thickened at an impossible pace, digging into the princess's throat and drawing more blood, which seeped into the fur coat that was growing on his arms. His hands had become so large that they nearly encompassed her entire head. His thundering, throaty snarls drowned out all the whimpering. She wasn't into it anymore. It was too much. Her eyes had been bigger than her stomach, but all the crying, scratching, and otherwise thrashing around in the whole world wasn't about to come between Charles and finishing what he started. And finish he did, the world around him momentarily going out of focus as he did so, overtaken by the flickering yellow light, and for a moment all he could see was an array of black and yellow kaleidoscope patterns, turning and falling into each other, constantly forming new shapes. What snapped him out of his temporary dive into nothingness was the feeling of something slowly pushing up under him. He looked down and saw that the princess's belly was now growing just as fast as his claws had been. Out and out it ballooned until it stopped, causing her to sweat and wince in pain all the while. Then, kicking. Charles sniffed and studied the belly as the bumping grew more rapid. The princess was no longer trying to fight him off. Whatever was happening inside of her now demanded all of her attention. Charles, not really paying too much mind to any of it beyond sniffing with mild interest, suddenly realized that with one appetite satisfied, another rose up. One mighty roar, and Wolfman Charles was digging in, starting with the juiciest part. He doesn't remember seeing much of what was inside, just a leg and a hand, really. Dogs aren't really known to care what they're eating anyways, so long as it tastes good. The princess was shrieking now. Her final attempt at life-or-death fighting did as little good as before, and in the end, she was left with nothing but her beautiful face with wide-open eyes, a partially shattered skeleton, and the leftover scraps of meat that Charles didn't want. Evidently, her screams were loud enough to be heard, because just as Charles was done licking his chops, about 10 men rushed into the room. It was the king, clad with chainmail and a shiny golden cape that mirrored the rest of the room, and a few of his men, also wearing chainmail, but nothing quite as stunning. The only words spoken for the rest of the dream were from His Majesty. "Monster!" he cried. "What have you done with my child?" Charles said nothing in return, not in any human language at least. He stood up on the bed and roared at the lot of them. The king and his men drew swords, and the two sides charged at one another. Being cut by all the blades here and there was a bit of a distraction, but no big deal. The tallest one was like a child next to Charles under the full moon. Chainmail crunched, so did bones, men screamed like women, bodies were ripped open and flung against the wall, and soon they were all slaughtered like a herd of unattended cattle. The noises stopped. Wolfman Charles stood among the remains of all his disembodied victims, huffing and puffing. Still, the moon's golden light danced and shimmered, to the point now where he couldn't properly see anything. It began to take over his vision again, and the last thing he saw was his watery reflection in the vanity mirror, his long snout bearing teeth with bits of flesh stuck between them, his giant gnarled hands with claws that reduced an armored warrior to a squawking chicken, and shiny, silvery blue dog eyes that exhibited no emotion but hunger right before he rushed at it. Chapter 10. I woke up early the next morning. Charles was chainsaw snoring in his bed across the room. I got up, and then I noticed the puddle of sweat under his hulking, hairy body. I stripped down and stepped into the shower, where I did more thinking and fretting than washing myself. Between Darcy and the suits, I had plenty to worry about, ulcers or no ulcers. As I often do when I start to fret, I whispered to myself, "It's gonna be all good. You've made it this far. Just one more night." Then, in response to these whispers, thoughts of an opposing nature zipped through my head. I never say these thoughts out loud. I'm always afraid of giving them too much power. What if today was the day? What if Darcy had it all calculated according to the full moon, and she was just taking the opportunity to fuck with my head in the meantime, right before she rips it off? "All right, calm down now," I whispered. "She ain't all that. Charles knocked her out once already, right? So she's not invincible." Then, another one of those opposing thoughts came to blindside me. "But that's Charles," it said. "We're talking about you, pussy boy." There wasn't any shampoo, so I had to rub the little complimentary bar of soap in my hands until I had enough bubbles to wash my hair. When I got out of the shower, I suppose I felt somewhat clean. Not as clean as I'd have liked, but probably about as clean as I was going to get. There weren't any big towels, so I had to use a little hand rag to get somewhat dried off. My clothes became damp as soon as I put them on, but now that I'd had myself a shower, at least I was somewhat more calm than before. Charles was sitting up now. "What's good?" I asked, leaning on the bathroom doorway. "You sure do take some long-ass showers." "Oh, yeah, that. My bad. It takes a minute for me to come." Charles laughed and rubbed his eyes. "Yeah, I get it," he said. "I always have the same problem. Cigarette time?" "It's always cigarette time." Charles was about to jump out of bed, but then he stopped. "I think I lost my pack," he said. "Well, you can have a spirit, that is if it's not too far below your standards." He chuckled and said it was fine, but he did need to get a pack of Marlboros as soon as possible. We both got fully dressed and stepped outside. We decided to head over to the store as soon as cigarette time was over. I told him about what had happened with Darcy and the suits, not mentioning how I'd let a tramp into the room and spent money to give him beer. For the first time, Charles seemed to take these things a bit more seriously. He thought for a moment, then spoke. "Once I'm gone, stay inside the room," he told me. "Unless you need to smoke or something, in which case, stay by the door and go right back in when you're done." I nodded. "You still got that knife, right?" I patted my belt line. "Damn right I do." "Okay, good. You shouldn't have any problems, but if you do..." He thought for another moment. "If you have to use the knife on her, don't let her live. Then, once you take care of her, dip the fuck out of here." He handed me the keys. "Are you going to be able to find me?" "Of course," he said, tapping his nose. "I'll always find you, no matter what." I put the keys in my pocket, nodding and saying, "Alrighty then," doing everything in my power to hide my reluctance. At first, Charles was going to get a bag full of 40s at the convenience store, but then he changed his mind. At the cost of $5 in gas, we upgraded to 2 bottles of Gentleman Jack from the supermarket. By we, I mean Charles, who went in while I waited in the truck, and by upgraded, I mean Charles stole the bottles and the security guards ate his dust. The engine was already on by the time the poor suckers passed the vending machines. With what painfully little experience I had driving stick to aid me, I was still able to tear out of the parking lot without any further pursuit. Somewhere further down the way back, I pulled over and we switched seats. I held the bottles for the rest of the trip. It wasn't even 3 yet when we were kicking back in the room and clinking bottles. It would have been earlier had we not stopped for burgers, fries, and ice cream. There we sat, gobbling down what was left, Charles drinking at a much faster rate than me. It was over this meal that Charles, swaying from one side to the other, having thrown up once already to give himself room for more liquor that is, not more burgers and ice cream, laid his hairy, clawed hands on my shoulders. "Nicholas," he said, taking his time to search for adequate words, "I want you to know that you have my, permission." He blinked his eyes a few times. "Yeah, you have my permission." "Permission to do what?" "Permission to write about me, anything you want." He lost his balance, and I let him fall on my shoulders. "Anything?" I asked, ignoring the ketchup he was getting on my shirt. "Any fucking thing, man," said Charles. I'm gonna show you what I am. Yeah, show you what I am." He started to nod off. I helped him lay down in his bed, and he slept. There was still ketchup on his fingers. And right about him I did. Settled into my own bed with the notepad on my lap and the bottle at my side, I wrote for a good 3 hours or so, looking over at Charles every so often to smirk at him when he made a funny noise. Aside from that, everything was peaceful. Everything was good. Everything was good, that is, until Charles woke up again and started convulsing. That really killed the mood, honestly. Like the swashbuckling Eagle Scout that I am, I sat there and watched, having no idea what to do. He moaned and winced, writhing around like an erotic dancer. This had to be it. Why so early, though? I said, "Charles, what the fuck, man? It's not even dark out yet." He didn't reply, but instead continued to convulse and thrash from side to side. Realizing that I probably ought to do something besides sit there and watch, I jumped to the floor and stood there, watching. I stretched my hands out to him with the intent to help him, but then I remembered I knew nothing about dealing with live werewolf transformations, so I shrunk my hands back and just kept on gawking. The convulsions stopped. Charles, between heaving breaths, told me, "Don't worry. It's all good. It happens a few times before yeah." "Oh, so I have to deal with this shit a few times tonight, then?" "No, it's good," panted Charles, wincing in pain as he sat up. "It's just a sign that I need to get going. Now, where are my cigarettes?" By now, it was getting dark outside. We had cigarette time, Charles once again being half naked with a gigantic pair of sweatpants. It was a different pair than before, and it had a string at the waist to hold them up. I asked what had happened to the other pair. Charles had no idea. "So this is it, man," said Charles. "Last full moon of the month. Think you can handle it?" "Long as you can handle it," I said. "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm gonna be fine. I'm worried about how you..." Charles was seized by a legion of sharp pains again. I was able to catch him doubled over on my shoulder and help him back up, nearly losing my own balance. He regained composure. "Anyways, I should probably get going." He cleared his throat. "Anyways, good luck. Stay in the room." The bedside lamp was the only light in the room. I had to stop at the mat because I was taken aback by the cozy effect that its dim yellow glow gave off. I glanced at the bottle on the bedside table, still with some juice in it, and the manuscript laying next to it. I remembered the snacks I had in the fridge. Tonight was going to be a nice one. I stuffed my face and sipped what I figured to be about a shot. I lit a smoke inside. Fuck going out. Fuck Darcy. That door was staying locked, no exceptions. I picked an empty beer can off the floor, there were plenty of those, and took it with me to bed so I could ash in it. Carefully, I transferred my cigarette to my left hand so I could use the pen with my right, notepad in my lap, and my back to the wall with a pillow supporting it. I let out a long breath. Gotta savor the little things. According to legend, Ernest Hemingway's advice was to write Drunk and Edit Sober. According to historians, he didn't actually say that and was in fact opposed to the idea. I chose to ignore reality. Slow down the brain so it doesn't overheat, I say, and let it cruise for a smoother trip. 2 pages or about 500 words passed in no time at all, and about 2 more before I tired. I looked at the clock. 3 hours had gone by, and I hadn't even noticed. As soon as I shifted my body, I could feel the cramp I'd been building up in my lower back. I sat up straight and sipped some more liquor. By this point, I'd already had plenty of sips here and there, and this one turned out to be just a wee bit past my limits. In a moment, I could feel it creeping up on me. First a very strong buzz, then a little too strong of a buzz, then the dizziness. I knew I'd have to stand up if I didn't want to spill my guts all over the page, and not in a good way. I wobbled, but thanks to the bedside table with the lamp I accidentally bumped and knocked over, I didn't fall down. I fumbled for my pack and lighter, starting another smoke, and then dropping the pack on the floor. I had a cigarette, but it wasn't cigarette time by any means. Cigarette time implies thoughtful reflection, and there was no way I could focus on any one thought besides hoping not to throw up. Then, to add to the anxiety, my brain decided to put on a slideshow for me, showcasing all the different ways Darcy could come and get me, flashing them all one by one in quick succession. I tried staring at my shoes, but the floor was moving so much it was no better. The boat was rocking, and Ernest Hemingway wasn't there to help me. I held on for dear life, trying my damnedest not to let it capsize. I lurched into the bathroom. As I unloaded into the toilet bowl, I thought, at least I made it. Spit out the residue, flush, wash your mouth. Much better now. Take a deep breath. Pick the still-burning cigarette off the floor. Turn around. "What's the matter, young man?" Darcy was in the bathroom. The cigarette fell from my mouth again. "Oh, Jiminy Christmas, hun!" She frowned at me. The pigment in her skin was almost totally gone. That is, if you still wanted to call it skin. At this point, it was much more like a bunch of brittle, rubbery wrapping paper stretched around to cover her pointy bones. She bent down. "Here you are, sweetie." She stood up and offered my cigarette back to me. I held my breath. There were 2 options. Take the stogue, get my face eaten. Don't take the stogue, still get my face eaten. Not a hard one. I raised my hand to take it, but then she interrupted. "Wait, actually, is it okay if I take a drag off it?" I let go of my breath. "Yeah, sure." She took a long one while I stood with my hand still frozen in the same position. She held it out for me once again, and it took me a good second or 2 to remember how to move my arm again and take it, taking special caution to touch only the cigarette and not her. I took a puff, holding it shakily, and wondered what sort of diseases I was contracting. "Thanks so much, hun," said Darcy, exhaling an exasperated breath. "My feet just won't leave me alone, burning hot as coals." I looked down at her feet. The bandages were still there, but now they were tattered to the point where I could see a few of her rotting diseased toenails poking out. "What do you think's up with them?" I asked. Though my heart was pounding in fear of a violent death, I knew the only option was to keep playing dumb. "Well, how am I supposed to know?" said Darcy, looking at me like I'd just broken her tweaking little heart, which made my heart quicken, even more than it had already, because I knew too well that if Darcy were pushed the wrong way, she might turn on the angry eyes. I didn't know yet what the angry eyes were supposed to signal, and I didn't want to either. With her blocking the doorway, it was going to be one hell of a pickle trying to escape this time. "All I know is I really need to find some clear soon," she whined, "or I'll just about die from the pain." She raised her brow and stuck out her bottom lip, adding, "You know this to be true." I said, "Oh, well, I don't have any clear, sorry, man." Darcy stamped her foot like an angry toddler. "Oh, gosh darn it," she said. I thought for sure you'd have some. It just hurts so bad. Don't you get it? I need your help, homie. Won't you be a gentleman and help a lady in need? My kids can't help me. I don't even know where they are." "Wait, you have kids?" "Yeah, I got 3 of them." "Oh, sweetie, you think I could get another drag off of that?" She held out the universal 2-fingered sign for a cigarette request, and I realized by the ash building up that I hadn't smoked on it for a while. "Sure, have the rest of it." I handed it over. "Really? The whole thing?" "Yeah, it's fine. I got more." "Thank you so much, sweetie." She took a drag and held it, shaking her head at the ceiling, then let it all out like a smokestack. "Hot damn, that's good," she said. By this point, it was like she'd forgotten I was even there. She swung her hips back and forth as she smoked, one arm crossed, holding up her cigarette arm from the elbow, eyes closed in bliss, and bobbing her head from left to right. To this day, I wonder what song she was dancing to. I reached for my pocket. "I think I'll bust out another one," I said. "Sure," she replied, eyes still closed. "Go right ahead." With one hand, I dug into my pocket, slowly, making an effort to do it loudly. With my other hand, I curled my fingers under the bottom of my shirt, watching to make sure her eyes were still shut, then went for it. I wrestled my hand around in my pocket even louder so I could drown out the sound of the unsheathing knife. Then I said, "Ah, here they are." And just like that, the knife was in her gut. It wasn't hard to do either, maybe about as hard as sticking a pen through a cardboard box. I ripped it out, then punched her in the same spot. She fell back and hit her head on the wall. As she fell, she gave me a look, but it wasn't the angry eyes. They were her normal eyes, but with a look of surprise so hilarious that they stick in my mind even more clearly. I slammed the bathroom door behind me. I dashed around the room until I found the keys to the truck. In 3 seconds, I was slamming the front door behind me and tearing through the motel parking lot. I set out on a frantic little journey with no destination except far away from there. Chapter 11. Life is all right when you're parked under a quiet little overgrown tree at night and you've still got about half your pack of smokes left. Take your normal everyday cigarette time and add an extra shot of bliss to it. It's best saved for when you've just stabbed an old lady in a motel bathroom and fled the scene. Once I'd had about half a cigarette and quit panting, I came to a decision. Stay awake all night in the truck, right here in this very spot most likely, and let Charles sniff me out after sunup. Very simple, no need to get an ulcer. But then it hit me. My manuscript was still in there. There wasn't much in it yet, but it still contained a lot of details about Charles and me, information that may have been of interest to the feds, or worse, the suits. God forbid if someone were to report Darcy's body, no more than 48 hours after I'd been questioned about talking to her, right before she ate somebody's face. Jesus H. Christ, poor Joseph. And then it hit me, even harder, that all the money was still in there too. Convenience store heist money. The connection being made was unlikely, but my paranoid ass wasn't going to rest easy with it sitting there. We needed the gas anyhow. No way around it. I had to go back, and fast. I started the truck and took off. Not being from the area, I can't remember how I was able to find my way back. I can't even remember if I looked at a single road sign the whole trip. It was like something just guided me there. Pulling up to the room was as natural as eating a bowl of oatmeal on a Wednesday morning. I had one more cigarette, smoking it to buy me 5 minutes before I forced myself to go back inside. Everything was quiet, and I could see that the lights were on as I'd left them. I'd have to go to the office first and get a new key card, and then I'd have to clean up the mess. That would probably take all night. Hopefully I could get it done before Charles got back, and hopefully I'd be able to get rid of enough of the smell to be able to sleep that night. I got a new card and slipped back into the room, entering with the knife held up in neck-slashing position, just in case. I'd grapevined around and checked every corner and behind the door for crouching tweakers. All right. Everything was as I'd left it. Lights on, beer cans on the floor, manuscript on the bed, money on the table. Now to check the bathroom. I kept the knife held up and approached from the side. Spooks like to hide around corners. Make sure to close up your posture, too. That way she can't scratch at anything soft off the bat. Bend those knees, athletic stance. Make sure you're holding that knife good and sturdy, and when you get the guts... I ended up smacking away the shower curtain and slashing at nothing. I lunged behind the bathroom door. Still nothing. No sign of Darcy anywhere, except for the mess of drying blood on the floor. Where did she go? Hard to say. In any case, I'd still have to clean up the floor, or we'd never get our deposit back. I looked at the rest of the floor outside the bathroom. No trail, not even a drip. I'm no expert on combat, but I knew I'd stabbed her pretty good. She definitely should have bled more than that. It came off the floor easily enough. Dozens of paper towels were expended in the effort. Everything was calm once again, that is, everything except for me. I wanted to sleep, but I wasn't about to risk Darcy coming back yet again and catching me in the act. I probably would have just laid awake anyways with all the worries and questions buzzing around in my head like flies around dog shit. I spent the rest of the night awake in that room, pacing laps around it and chewing my fingernails. I won't even try to calculate how long I spent waving the knife around for practice. Eventually, somebody was going to come knocking at the door. I hoped for Charles, but planned for Mama D, slinking her way back with another reason to be angry. Chapter 12. So I'm guessing he was been plopped down when I let him in, after looking through the peephole, of course. Imagine my relief when I saw him on the other side of the door, and how heavily I sighed as I put the knife back in the sheath. He still had his sweats on. I guess the waistband tie was a good investment. Needless to say, Charles got an earful. "Yeah, I guess you could say I made it," I said, "except fucking Darcy showed up and I had to stab her in the gut." "So, she's still in here?" Charles leaned towards the bathroom. "No, that's the thing," I said. "So I fucking stabbed her, right? Then I kinda panicked and ran out, and then I came back after a little bit, and then she's just fucking gone, man." "Gone, huh?" "Yeah, man. There was still a bunch of blood and shit, and I cleaned it all up, but she was gone. Everything else was still in its place, and for some odd reason, she didn't even bleed on the way out." I pointed to the carpet. Charles thought for a moment. "How many times did you stab her?" "Once." "How hard?" "I don't know, pretty hard, I think. Full force of my arm." Charles nodded and stroked his chin, taking another moment to process it all, then said, "Well, I guess you better stab her twice next time." We left to go to the store again. I wanted to stay behind and sleep, but I went with. It wasn't worth being left alone again. We may have had no idea where she'd scampered off to, or when she might try to come back, but the blood was off the floor, which meant no case, and the money was still on the table, which meant Charles could buy another bottle of old number 7. The store had just barely opened when we got there, and the only other vehicles were the employees. Stealing the bottle would have been fun, I suppose, but the funny look we got from the cashier when he rang up the whiskey so early in the morning was the best thing I'd see it all week. We were on the way back to the truck when the barking started. It came from around the corner of the building. My hands were in my pockets, and Charles's were holding 2 grocery bags, one with the bottle and one with the snacks. Had his hands not been full, I'm sure they'd have snapped out at attention like mine did. "Roof, roof," said the dogs, running out towards us, 3 of them in total. In such situations, my instinctive reflex, for some odd reason, tends to be screaming, "Hey, hey, hey!" at my assailant over and over. This, of course, is exactly what I did. Though shameful to admit, this tactic has worked for me in the past, particularly with angry dogs. Usually it would scare them off, as long as I held my ground. Any Eagle Scout worth his patches knows not to run away from a predatory animal. That'll peg you as prey faster than you can say, "Oh shit, this animal just ripped my balls off." Unfortunately, it didn't seem to be working this time. The dogs, all fairly large, ran right up to us and started snapping. The 2 black ones came for Charles, and the white one came for me. It was only as tall as my waist, so it wasn't too much trouble to kick it in the face. I knocked it back for just long enough to take a couple of steps back, but it didn't waste any time lunging right back and jumping up to my chest. I did my best to swat it away, but the push was just strong enough to fell me backwards. Now the dog was on top of me. My arms flew up to its throat, and I squeezed as hard as I could, just barely keeping its thrashing and snapping jaws away from my pretty little face, every form of adrenaline and primal instinct rushing through to hold that grip at all costs. Its breath smelled like garbage and dead animals. Slobber dripped on my face. I kept my mouth shut in case a droplet decided to land inside. The barking was like shells dropping in Dresden next to my ears. Time slowed down as all this happened. My personal theory on the phenomenon of slowed down time in life or death situations is that when it happens, the Lord of the Great Spirit or whatever you want to call him is giving you a break, or in this case, throwing you a bone. That way you have a little extra time to strategize in a pinch. The grand revelation sent to me in this case was that the answer to my problem was hooked on my belt. It was a lot harder to hold off the beast with one arm than with 2. Very quickly, my throat arm started to shake like it does on your last set of weightlifting. My other arm, clammy and shaking, slapped around like a fish on my pants until I found the handle. Looking back, I think the Great Spirit might have thrown me a bone in advance when he made me forget to snap the button closed on the sheath, because my hands were so jittery now that I doubt I could have unfastened it. Had I been the skilled, calculating action hero video game protagonist I wish I was, I'd have stuck that dog right in the neck with one quick swoop. Since I wasn't, what I did instead was flail my arm around, trying simultaneously to get a good grip on the handle and to keep my other grip on the dog's throat. Both grips were slipping. My little grace period from the Great Spirit was running out quick. The dog was inching its way toward my face, barking and snapping and never letting up. I got in my first lick, and the dog yelped, pulling back just a little. I must have landed the knife somewhere around its waist. It only went in a little ways, though, and Rover was still at it. I pulled it out and made the same motion again, sticking the knife a little deeper, and the dog yelped a little louder. In a sudden burst of strength that definitely came from the Great Spirit, my choking hand tightened, and I was able to shove the beast back to where I'd had it before. One more stab, and I finally got a deep one. The dog let up and tried to retreat. Still holding its throat, I yanked it back to me and made another stab. No more barking, not even a yelp. Just a sad and sickly little whine from the pit of its guts. I threw poor Rover off to the side and scrambled back to my feet. My assailant was bleeding out on the pavement now, trying to crawl off to wherever it came from. I debated on whether to grant it a merciful execution, but I never got to decide. Charles lunged past me and picked the dog up. I followed the dying animal with my eyes, being lifted above Charles's head and thrown back to the ground where it broke at least a couple of ribs. For me, this already would have been overkill, but Wolfman Charles wasn't done yet. For a second I thought one of the other two dogs was barking at me from off to the side, but no, those suckers were already dead and tattered. The sound I heard, a ferocious, throaty growl, had come out of Charles's mouth, right as he dropped his body down to rip into Rover's torso with his teeth, right through the fur. What I witnessed next was far superior to anything you'll see on the Nature Channel. While he might not have been in his complete full moon lycanthropic state, the man was still covered in hair, his teeth and claws were still big enough to eat you with, and though the moon was no longer totally full, he still had it in his eyes. The dog that I had just struggled to buck off of me, so much that the Great Spirit had to come bail me out, was now being dug into like a slice of meat pie. I'd like to say I didn't want to look, but honestly, you couldn't have paid me to look away. The carnage was too great. A piece of dog guts flew off and hit me in the leg. I jumped and took a few steps back so I could watch from a safer distance. Charles finished his meat pie and stepped away, wiping his mouth with his forearm, not that there was any point to that with it being just as blood-soaked as his face. The dog was barely recognizable now, save for the partially spared head, but even that was only recognizable from a certain angle. The same went for the other two, I noticed when I finally glanced in their direction. Still doggies kinda sorta, but definitely not how the Great Spirit meant for them to look. Just a minute ago, there were 3 dogs, but now there were just 3 piles of scrap that you might want to sift through if you were trying to build your own Franken-dog at home and wanted to save money on spare parts. Charles picked up his grocery bags, which he'd evidently been able to set down before he started going at it with the 2 black dogs, judging by how the jack bottle hadn't been shattered on the pavement. He didn't say a single word about what had just happened. I had to jog to catch up with him as he continued on to the truck. "So, you're gonna need a shower then, huh?" I asked. "I was gonna do that anyways," said Charles. "The question is whether I'm having a drink before or after."